Picture yourself walking through the front doors of a psychiatric hospital. You are not ill. You are not in crisis. You are a psychologist, a graduate student, a painter, a housewife, a perfectly ordinary person who slept well last night, ate breakfast this morning, and has no history of mental illness whatsoever. You approach the admissions desk and tell the psychiatrist one thing. One single symptom. You tell them you have been hearing a voice. The voice says 3 words: hollow, empty, thud. That is all. Nothing more. You are admitted immediately. Diagnosed with schizophrenia. Given antipsychotic medication. Locked inside. From that moment forward, you behave completely normally. You stop reporting the voice. You are polite, cooperative, and lucid. You speak honestly to anyone who will listen. You take notes in a journal. You tell the staff clearly and calmly that you feel fine, that you'd like to go home. You are not believed. You will spend the next 19 days, on average, inside that hospital. You will be watched, medicated, labeled, and processed. The other patients, the ones the staff are certain are genuinely ill, will look at you and say, "You don't belong here. You're not sick. You're checking up on the hospital, aren't you?" The patients can see you clearly. The professionals cannot, and that gap, that devastating system-wide failure of perception, is the story of one of the most explosive studies in the history of psychiatry. Welcome back to the darkest experiments. Last time, we watched Philip Zimbardo lose himself inside his own prison study, absorbed so deeply into a role that he could no longer see the harm unfolding in front of him. We talked about how institutions shape perception, how roles override judgment, and how the environment we are placed in can quietly rewrite who we think we are. Today, we go deeper into that same territory. But this time, the institution is a psychiatric hospital. And the question being asked is one that cuts to the very core of what mental health care is for. Can psychiatry reliably distinguish between the sane and the insane? In 1973, David Rosenhan set out to find the answer. What he found shook the psychiatric establishment to its foundations, and the tremors are still being felt today. The early 1970s were a turbulent time for psychiatry. Critics, including the psychiatrist Thomas Szasz and the sociologist Irving Goffman, had been arguing for years that mental illness was not a medical reality in the way physical illness was, but a social construction, a label applied by those in power to those who deviated from norms. Psychiatric hospitals, they argued, were not places of healing. They were places of control. The psychiatric establishment pushed back hard against these claims. Diagnosis, they insisted, was a rigorous process. Trained professionals could reliably identify genuine illness. The system worked. David Rosenhan, a Stanford psychologist, decided to put that claim to the test. Not with surveys or theoretical arguments, with people, real people, walking through real doors, telling a real lie, and then watching what happened next. Rosenhan recruited 8 people, himself included, to serve as pseudo-patients. The group included a psychology graduate student, 3 psychologists, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a painter, and a housewife. None had any history of serious mental illness. All were instructed to present themselves at 12 different psychiatric hospitals across 5 different states and report the same single symptom: hearing a voice that said the words hollow, empty, and thud. Those 3 words were chosen deliberately. They were vague. They were ambiguous. And importantly, there was no established psychiatric literature linking them to any recognized condition. Rosenhan wanted to give the hospitals the minimum possible justification for diagnosis and see what they did with it. Every single pseudopatient was admitted. 11 of the 12 admissions resulted in a diagnosis of schizophrenia. The 12th was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis. Not one hospital identified any of them as healthy. Once admitted, the pseudopatients stopped reporting the voice entirely. They behaved in every observable way, completely normally. They were cooperative, friendly, and articulate. When asked how they were feeling, they said fine. They said the voice had gone. They said they wanted to be discharged. They kept detailed notes, openly, in front of staff, making no attempt to conceal their note-taking. In most hospitals, this behavior was simply recorded in their charts as further evidence of their condition. One nurse's note read, "Patient engages in writing behavior." The note-taking was not investigated as a possible sign of normalcy. It was filed as a symptom. The pseudopatients were held for between 7 and 52 days. The average was 19 days. They were given a combined total of nearly 2,100 pills during their stays, most of which they secretly disposed of, noticing that other patients were doing exactly the same thing. When they were eventually discharged, not one of them was described as having recovered or having been misdiagnosed. The discharge notes read, "Schizophrenia in remission." The label had not been removed. It had simply been paused. After the study was published and caused its initial uproar, a prestigious research and teaching hospital challenged Rosenhan directly. They had heard about his findings and they were not impressed. They told him that his results could never be replicated at their institution, that their staff were too well trained to be fooled by pseudopatients. Rosenhan accepted the challenge. He told the hospital that over the following 3 months, he would send one or more pseudopatients through their doors. The staff were asked to rate each new patient on the likelihood of being a pseudopatient. Over those 3 months, 193 patients were admitted. Of those, 41 were identified with high confidence by at least one staff member as probable pseudopatients. 23 were suspected by a psychiatrist. 19 were suspected by both a psychiatrist and another staff member. Rosenhan had sent no pseudopatients at all. The hospital had falsely identified real patients as imposters, all because they had been primed to look for them. In one direction, the system saw illness everywhere. In the other, it saw deception everywhere. What it could not reliably do, in either condition, was see clearly. Beyond the diagnostic findings, Rosenhan's report documented something equally disturbing: the day-to-day experience of being a patient inside these institutions. The pseudopatients described a world of profound invisibility. Staff moved through the wards with minimal interaction with patients. When pseudopatients approached a psychiatrist or nurse and asked a direct question, "Excuse me, when am I likely to be discharged?" they were routinely ignored, talked past, or given a brief response delivered without eye contact before the staff member walked on. One pseudopatient tracked these interactions systematically. In 1,400 approaches to staff, he received a meaningful response, one that involved genuine eye contact and a real answer, fewer than 1% of the time. The label of mental illness, once applied, colored every perception. A pseudopatient's note-taking was a symptom. Their frustration at being held against their will was a symptom. Their insistence on their own sanity was, paradoxically, taken as further evidence of their condition. Because as any psychiatrist of the era could tell you, insisting you are not ill is exactly what a sick person would do. This is the logical trap at the heart of psychiatric institutionalization, and Rosenhan named it with unusual clarity. Once you are labeled, everything you do is filtered through that label. The diagnosis becomes the lens through which all behavior is interpreted. And a lens, as any photographer knows, determines not just what you see, but what you miss. The publication of On Being Sane in Insane Places in the journal Science in 1973 was an earthquake. The psychiatric establishment reacted with fury, defensiveness, and eventually genuine reform. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the foundational reference document for all psychiatric diagnosis, underwent significant revision. Advocacy for patients' rights accelerated. The movement toward deinstitutionalization, already underway, gained powerful new momentum. In more recent years, Rosenhan's study has itself come under scrutiny. Investigative journalist Susanna Cahalan, in her 2019 book The Great Pretender, raised serious questions about the accuracy of some of Rosenhan's reporting, suggesting that his own case notes may have contained significant embellishments. The debate about the study's precise scientific validity continues. But this much remains undeniable. 8 people walked into psychiatric hospitals, reported a single ambiguous symptom, and were held for an average of 19 days. That happened. It is documented. And the questions it raises about the reliability of diagnosis, the humanity of institutional care, and the power of a label to reshape reality, those questions have not been answered by any subsequent study. They are still waiting. The Rosenhan experiment is not just a critique of psychiatry. It is a study in the power of categorization and what happens when a label becomes more real than the person wearing it. We do this everywhere, not just in hospitals. In workplaces, where someone is labeled a problem employee and every subsequent mistake confirms the label. In schools where a child is identified as difficult and every act of independence is filtered through that judgment. In relationships where we decide who someone is and then stop looking at who they actually are, a label is a shortcut. And like all shortcuts, it saves time by sacrificing accuracy. The Rosenhan study is a standing invitation to look past the label, to ask not what category does this person fit, but who is this person right now in front of me? It is also a reminder that the systems we build to help people can, without constant vigilance and humility, become systems that simply process them, and that the difference between being seen and being processed is not a small one. For the people on the receiving end, it is everything. David Rosenhan walked into a psychiatric hospital, told a small lie, and exposed a very large truth. The truth was not that psychiatrists are incompetent or that mental illness is not real. The truth was that systems, any systems, however well-intentioned, can lose sight of the individual inside them. That once we assign a category to a person, we stop seeing a person and start seeing a category. That truth belongs not just to medicine. It belongs to all of us. Next time, we leave the hospital and go back to a laboratory, where a psychologist named Martin Seligman strapped dogs into harnesses and subjected them to shocks they could not escape. What those dogs did next, or rather, what they failed to do, became one of the most important discoveries in the history of mental health. And it holds a mirror up to every human being who has ever felt that trying is pointless. That is learned helplessness, and it is coming right up. If this episode changed the way you think about labels, clinical, professional, or personal, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe so you're here for every experiment in this series. And thank you genuinely for listening. I'll see you in the next one.